Okay, my name is Dr. Tina Morin. I am a lecturer in English at the School of English, Irish and Communication in UL. And my research specialism is Irish Gothic literature. And today is really just a chance for me to chat about one of my favorite novels, a controversial but also incredibly widely read, if now mostly forgotten, Gothic tale by the eccentric Anglo-Irish clergyman Charles Robert Maturin, whose birthday, incidentally, was last Friday, the 25th of September. And the reasons I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about Melmoth are because, first of all, Maturin is something of a focal point in my research. I wrote a book on his fiction called Charles Robert Maturin and the Haunting of Irish Romantic Fiction in 2011. There it is on the screen. I'm also, I don't know if you can see it, but I'm holding it up, a copy of it for you. To be honest, it's probably not available in all good booksellers, but you can access it online in an ebook version at that link, or order a hard copy straight from the publisher if you're interested. But anyway, so my background is in Irish Gothic, and I wrote this book on Charles Robert Maturin, and I wrote the book largely because Charles Robert Maturin is one of these kind of intriguing, interesting figures in Irish literary history. He was fairly well known at the time, but has been neglected since his death in 1824. And certainly when we think of 19th century Irish literary characters, Maturin is on the margins of that kind of body of authors. But this year is a really good time to talk about Melmoth the Wanderer because 2020 marks the 200th anniversary of its publication. It was first published in 1820. And so I'm spending a lot of time this year really kind of marking this event and promoting Maturin and his fiction in particular. He wrote several other novels besides Melmoth the Wanderer, and he was also a dramatist. His play Bertram, or The Castle of St. Aldobrand, which was first performed in London in 1816, was the runaway hit of the season. But again, a bit like Maturin's novels, we tend not to kind of remember his works, his dramatic works today. So 2020 marks the 200th anniversary of Melmoth's publication, and like I said, I'm really trying to mark this event, as are, I know, other scholars in the field of Irish literary studies and in Gothic studies. A couple of things that are coming up to kind of commemorate this event. I have a collaboration with Marsh's Library in Dublin, in which we'll be producing an online exhibition of the materials at Marsh's Library that Maturin, in all probability, consulted while he was researching and writing Melmoth the Wanderer. So I think that's really fun and interesting, and I'm hoping that the exhibition will bring a lot of attention to the novel and indeed to Marsh's Library, because Maturin regularly worked at Marsh's Library. He was based in Dublin. He lived not far from Marsh's Library, and he was kind of known to kind of haunt the Dublin streets and various Dublin buildings, including Marsh's. We're going largely by intertextual references here, right? The novel or the text that Maturin refers to both directly and indirectly in Melmoth the Wanderer to kind of piece together what he read at Marsh's. So it's a really interesting project. Another thing that I'll be involved in is the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies Melmoth's Afterlives event, which will take place later this autumn, in November, in fact. And it features a series of virtual events, including a reading with Sarah Perry, the author of a 2018 novel, Melmoth, which I'll talk about again in a couple of minutes. Okay, but for those of you who haven't read Melmoth the Wanderer, I just want to give you a brief kind of, I suppose, synopsis of the novel. It's this fantastic collection of tales. It's not a collection of short stories, though, as we'll see in a minute, it kind of began life as that. But it's a collection of tales that are all tied together by the figure of Melmoth the Wanderer himself, who is an Anglo-Irishman who has made a pact with the devil in exchange for forbidden knowledge. And because of this pact, he has been forced to wander the world for the span of his preternatural existence, searching for a replacement. So all of the tales in the novel, and they're kind of described as nested tales. Sometimes the book is kind of likened to a Russian doll. So each of these tales tells of Melmoth's temptation of another potential victim. Okay. And I suppose I don't want to, without giving too much away, let's just say that Melmoth is not a particularly effective villain. And the novel ends, again, without giving too much away, on a note of uncertainty, shall we say. Now, this brief summary might suggest that the novel is fairly reader friendly, but the structure is notoriously labyrinthine and has simultaneously fascinated and frustrated readers and critics alike since its publication back in 1820. Now, as I suggested, there's a kind of reason why the novel is organized or structured in the way that it is. In particular, Maturin had initially conceived of the novel as a collection of short stories that he could potentially prolong forever. As long as Melmoth the Wanderer, the figure of Melmoth the Wanderer, was still alive and still hadn't successfully tempted his victim. And you can imagine how appealing that idea might be, financially at least, for a perpetually cash-strapped Anglo-Irish clergyman whose eccentricities, his love of finery, his authorship of dramas and popular romances set him at odds with the Church of Ireland establishment very early on in his career, and basically put paid to any hopes he might have had for preferment in the church. And I like to describe this when I'm teaching Melmoth the Wanderer, when I'm teaching text by Maturin to my undergraduates at UL. I like to kind of describe Maturin's position within the church by reference to a Catholic church kind of example, but a popular cultural Catholic church example, and that is the example of Father Ted. Maturin is essentially the Father Dougal in that relationship. He never gets to be the kind of parish priest. He always has to be the helper. Okay, so he never gets his own seat in the Church of Ireland. He maintains a very kind of minor, low position within the Church of Ireland for all of his career, and as a result, is forced to turn to other kind of jobs, I suppose you would say, to help make money for himself and his growing family. So for instance, he starts a kind of school for students of Trinity College Dublin, or a preparatory school for students wanting to enter Trinity College Dublin. And he also claims repeatedly in his novels, that in the prefaces to his novels, that the only reason he's writing is because he needs to make money. Now, it's a little bit disingenuous. He clearly loved to write and he clearly fancied himself a kind of author and a dramatist, and wanted the kind of fame that contemporaries such as Sir Walter Scott was enjoying, but in his prefaces he continually claims, I'm just doing this because I need to make money. Okay, and I suppose the obvious question here is, you know, why should we celebrate Melmoth? It's its 200th anniversary, but what makes it worth remembering right now? It's not, I should say, because I'm a glutton for punishment, though I'd be the first to admit that the novel is a challenging read at times. It's funny, though, when you think about it, because compared to a contemporary text like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was published in 1818, and which 2 years ago celebrated its bicentenary, there's really quite a stark difference. When we look at Frankenstein, for instance, its bicentenary occasioned a sustained international commemoration, the likes of which Melmoth the Wanderer is unlikely to inspire this year or probably ever. Okay, so I'm really interested in why this is, right? I'm interested in the processes of memory and remembering and forgetting that would kind of keep a hold of Frankenstein and yet forget or nearly forget Melmoth the Wanderer. And part of the intrigue of this has to do with the rather kind of peculiar position that Melmoth the Wanderer holds in the literary history of Irish literature. The novel is frequently described as a Gothic masterpiece, and it's often described as a masterpiece, often described as this kind of central magnum opus. But it nevertheless remains a kind of oddity, particularly in scholarship of Gothic and Irish Gothic literature. And this has to do with its timing. In the 1790s, we have the emergence or the kind of heyday of what's sometimes referred to as first wave Gothic fictions, associated with writers like Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis. And it's understood that this first wave Gothic fiction has all but died out by the time Maturin publishes Melmoth the Wanderer in 1820. And so Maturin is understood often to kind of produce this novel that is at one and the same time the kind of peak of first wave Gothic fiction and the very last kind of belated death knell of this same body of Gothic fiction. At the same time, it is often seen to begin or initiate a peculiarly Irish Gothic strain of Gothic literature that would fully come into fruition at the close of the 19th century with writers such as Sheridan Le Fanu, Oscar Wilde, and Bram Stoker. Okay, now recent research and recent kind of criticism has demonstrated that these understandings are somewhat misguided. That in fact Gothic fiction, this first wave Gothic fiction that we see in the 1790s, never really goes away in the 1820s. And at the same time, there's a much longer, much richer history of Irish Gothic literature, or Gothic literature by Irish writers, that extends well beyond this kind of, I suppose, holy trinity of Irish writers. It's holy. What would you say? There's actually four of them: Maturin, Wilde, Stoker, and Le Fanu. But still, Melmoth the Wanderer has this kind of very strange position, neither quite first wave Gothic fiction, neither quite Irish Gothic of the late 19th century, something in between. And it's interesting because the novel itself has been frequently reprinted and translated since its first publication. In fact, the novel really has rarely been out of print since it was first published in 1820. But Melmoth hasn't become a kind of byword for horror in the way that Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde or Dracula have. And unlike these famous figures, Melmoth has yet to inspire a major motion picture, for instance. We don't have any TV adaptations or video games or Netflix series based on Melmoth the Wanderer. But the novel's impact continues to exert itself in diverse and colorful ways. And these are the pictures that I have on the slide there. On my left, there is a poster for the 2012 Port Stewart-based Big Telly Theatre Company's production of Melmoth the Wanderer, which was this fantastic dramatic adaptation of the novel that featured selections from the novel's interpolated tales, dramatized in part with masks and puppetry. And it was absolutely brilliant, so well done. And then, as I mentioned earlier, 2 years ago, British author Sarah Perry published her novel, her third novel, simply called Melmoth, which she dedicated to Maturin and in which she reimagines Maturin's Wanderer as this fantastically spectral woman preying upon individuals haunted by hidden crimes in a largely 20th century context. And just last year, a Florida-based microbrewery called Four Stacks Brewing Company introduced a new sour IPA, which they called, of all things, Melmoth the Wanderer. And I've yet to get to the bottom of the story behind that, but I'm fascinated by their naming of this IPA, this beer, after Melmoth the Wanderer. So I'm suggesting, right, that there are all these kind of traces, of Melmoth the Wanderer, even in popular culture today, even though we don't have, for instance, the major blockbuster film version of Melmoth the Wanderer, or, you know, the Netflix TV series adaptation. There are still these really interesting traces of its influence today. And these recent manifestations of Melmoth's very real cultural legacy and its impact build upon a longer history of adaptation and allusion that attests to the novel's, what we might call the novel's radiance, to use a term that Job Learson has applied to 19th century literature. Right, we may not have that Hollywood blockbuster version of Melmoth, but the novel's influence can still be felt far and wide from the 19th century to today. And in my earlier work on Melmoth and on Maturin's fictions, I kind of explored this a little bit, and I argued that Melmoth and Maturin indeed remain these kind of unearthly presences that haunt the works of countless authors, contemporary and otherwise, right? Balzac, Baudelaire, James Clarence Mangan, John Banville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Christina Rossetti, and Elizabeth Bowen, they all kind of reveal the influence of Maturin's Melmoth in their works. And Melmoth has been this really vital, enduring, and perhaps most interestingly transnational source of inspiration and fascination and creative revelation for these writers. And just to give you a sense of this, I've put on this slide here some of the French language translations that have appeared over the years. There were a number of other European language translations as well. Balzac wrote a brief sequel to the novel in 1835 called Melmoth Reconcilié. There were a couple of dramatic adaptations in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, in addition to that 2012 adaptation I talked about a minute ago. And then we get all these kinds of intertextual references, all these allusions to Melmoth the Wanderer in a really diverse range of Irish, European, British, and American literature, and indeed further afield. So the novel becomes really visible, in a sense, in this way, in the ways in which it's been used and adapted and integrated into other novels or other pieces of literature. So even as it becomes almost kind of invisible over the course of literary history, it becomes visible in these works, if that makes sense. Baudelaire, for instance, considered Melmoth the exemplary romantic outcast and made a number of indirect allusions to Maturin in works such as Les Fleurs de Mal, published in 1857, Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne in the States, in the meantime, both reveal the influence of Melmoth the Wanderer. And obviously in Ireland, there are many, many authors who kind of build upon Maturin's influence. Sheridan Le Fanu, James Clarence Mangan, Oscar Wilde, who famously paid homage to his great uncle by calling himself Sebastian Melmoth while in exile in France after his imprisonment. And then, I mean, those are just 19th century examples. When we start to get into the 20th and 21st century, there are other examples as well that attest to the really quite enduring influence of Melmoth. Melmoth is, I think, I would have to do a bit, I'd love to do a bit more work on this, but I do think that Melmoth is a key intertext in the title story of Elizabeth Bowen's short story collection, The Demon Lover, which was published in 1945. And then again, nearly 70 years later, Claire Kilroy's fictional treatment of Celtic Tiger Ireland, The Devil I Know, which was published in 2012, definitely draws upon Melmoth the Wanderer in its kind of treatment of what's going on in contemporary Ireland. And in between those two texts, you see Nabokov's Lolita, for instance, published in 1955, subtly revealing Melmoth's influence, with Professor Humbert calling his car Melmoth in that novel. And Melmoth makes a number of appearances in the works of John Banville, for instance, including Birchwood in 1973 and the Book of Evidence in 1989. And then, of course, there's Sarah Perry's Melmoth in 2018, which has been praised in particular for its adaptation of Maturin's model to produce a compelling commentary on social, political, and private trauma and its legacy in the modern era. As Alex Preston wrote in The Guardian, the novel, quote, asks us to consider both the importance of bearing witness and the toll it takes on those called to bear it. There's a sense that this is a book that seeks at once to provide a blueprint for how to negotiate the legacy of the atrocities of the 20th century and a model for resistance to contemporary violence. And Perry's ability to produce such a powerful and evocative text, one which unfortunately I don't really have time to talk about today, is a testament to her skills as a writer, but it's also a material form of bearing witness itself, testifying to, at least in part, right, is bearing witness to other atrocities and to other events in the novel, but it's also bearing witness to the wonderfully durable and sometimes overlooked influence of Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer. 200 years after the novel's initial original publication, right, we still don't have that major motion picture adaptation. We don't have the novel hasn't, as far as I'm aware, been optioned for the HBO or Netflix original series. Who knows? Maybe that's in the works. And if anybody's interested in doing that, you know, definitely drop me a line. But you know, if the novel's active and thoroughly international afterlife is anything to go by, right? I wonder if that's just a question of time, right? I think that Melmoth is still going to enjoy its day, and it's still going to enjoy its revival, and because it is a text that's really worth remembering. And I do often teach Maturin on my courses in UL. And just to take a minute to kind of tell you a little bit about one of the programs that I teach on in UL, and that is the MA in English, which is a one-year taught MA program consisting of kind of module work in the autumn and spring semesters, followed up by an MA dissertation written with the guidance of one or more staff members in English, either in the School of English, Irish and Communication, or sometimes also in the School of Modern Languages and Applied Linguistics. And there's also a 2-year part-time version of this program that's proven really popular over the last several years, and that consists of essentially the same thing, coursework that's done in the first 2 years, followed by a dissertation. And it's, as I say, proven really popular over the past couple of years. And there are some really exciting elements about the MA in English. In particular, aside from working from some of my amazing colleagues in the schools of English, Irish and Communication and Modern Languages and Applied Linguistics, our students collaborate with the students on the MA in Creative Writing to produce a fantastic literary journal called The Ohm Stone, which has just gone from strength to strength over the past couple of years and is a really worthwhile project, and certainly a project worth looking up. They're on Twitter. I can't remember their handle now, but they are on Twitter, and I know that submissions have closed for this year, and they've already started putting together the issue that will appear in the spring. We also have research specialisms in British, Irish, and American literature, in post-colonial theory, in feminist literary theory, Gothic and science fiction, early modern literature, just to name a few of them. So there's really something for everybody in the MA in English. So please do get in touch. I have put up on the slide there a link to the course website on UL's main site, and also my email address. I'm the course director right now, and I would welcome any questions you might have. Just send me an email. And otherwise, just thank you for joining me today. I hope that I have inspired you to go learn more about Melmoth the Wanderer, or pick it up and start reading it. It's available. It is available in all good bookstores, unlike my like my book, and you can get it in really great, affordable editions. The Oxford University Press edition is fantastic, and I would recommend picking it up. So thank you.